Welcome everyone to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we are really getting into a big one, a truly revolutionary book in science, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene.
That's right. And what we want to do in this deep dive, using the material you've shared with us about the book, is really dig into what makes it tick.
Yeah.
We're aiming to pull out the core ideas, those really surprising insights, and the arguments that just fundamentally shifted how a lot of people think about life. Basically giving you a shortcut to understanding this whole perspective.
It really is a shortcut worth taking. I mean, it came out back in the 70s, but honestly, it feels like it was way ahead of its time.
Absolutely.
It proposed this, well, radical shift, looking at evolution not through the lens of the individual animal or the group or even the species,
Right.
but focusing right down onto the gene itself. The gene is the thing that's actually being selected.
Mm-hmm. And one thing the descriptions we have really highlight is how readable it is. Dawkins apparently manages to tackle these huge biological questions in a way that's concise, yeah.
Yeah, thought-provoking.
Thought-provoking, definitely, but also accessible. Not like some dense academic text. It's meant to be enjoyable for anyone interested, like you listening now.
Perfect for what we do here. Okay, let's jump in. Where does Dawkins even begin with such a huge topic?
Right, so he starts with what he calls the deep problem, which is, the most fundamental question there is, really. How did all this incredible complexity?
Us, trees, everything.
Exactly. How did that arise from just simple atoms, non-living matter? It's the mystery of existence, basically.
And, okay, the best answer science has come up with for that is Darwin, right? Evolution by natural selection, simplicity building up complexity over immense time.
That's the bedrock, yes. But here's where Dawkins introduces a subtle but really important twist in how we talk about it. It helps clarify his whole gene-centered view. Instead of survival of the fittest, he prefers survival of the stable.
Survival of the stable. Why that specific wording? What's the difference?
Well, it shifts the emphasis onto what persists, what lasts. Think about the universe. You've got stars, galaxies, mountains, even ocean waves. These are all fundamentally stable patterns.
Patterns of atoms.
Exactly. Stable patterns of atoms or molecules. Atoms link up, they form molecules through chemical reactions. Those are just more complex, stable patterns. Stability is what endures, what resists falling apart.
Okay, I get that. Stability is key to persistence. So how does that apply to the origin of life? We're talking early Earth, the primeval soup.
Yes, the primeval soup. The book paints a picture based on what we think early Earth was like. We don't know the exact recipe, of course, but probably a watery environment, maybe lots of simple stuff like ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide.
And scientists have tried to mimic this in labs.
They have. The famous Miller-Urey type experiments. You take those simple chemicals, zap them with energy like sparks, simulating lightning or UV light, and what happens? These simple inorganic molecules, they spontaneously start linking up. They form more complex organic molecules, things like amino acids which build proteins or nucleotides, the bits that make up DNA.
So the building blocks of life could have just formed naturally.
That's what the experiments suggest. The basic ingredients were likely there, forming through natural chemistry in that early soup.
Okay, so the soup is simmering away, full of these complex molecules bumping into each other, and then something amazing happens, the key moment.
Precisely. Out of all that random bumping and forming, purely by chance, a molecule arises with a truly extraordinary new property. It can make copies of itself.
Ah, the replicator.
That's what Dawkins calls it, the replicator. It might not have been the biggest or most complex molecule around, but its ability to use other molecules in the soup as building blocks to assemble copies of itself. That was everything. It's like a template or a mold.
Guiding the formation of copies.
Yes, using the surrounding bits and pieces to make more templates just like it.
And once you have one, it starts multiplying.
It does.
But surely even then, some would be better than others. Did natural selection kick in immediately, right there at the molecular level?
Absolutely, right away. This is where survival of the stable really comes into play for replicators. Any tiny variation that made a replicator molecule better at persisting or copying would mean it became more numerous.
So what makes a replicator better?
The material points to three key things. First, longevity. Some molecule types might just be more chemically stable. They last longer before breaking down.
More time to make copies.
Exactly. Second, fecundity. How fast can it copy itself? If you've got type A making one copy a week and type B making one an hour, well, type B is going to take over the soup pretty quickly.
Makes sense. Speed matters.
And third, accuracy. Copying fidelity. Now, no copying process is perfect. There are always errors. But replicators that were more accurate would build up large populations of stable, functional copies. Less accurate ones might make lots of duds that fall apart.
Okay, but that accuracy point, it brings up something the book apparently addresses, a kind of paradox. If selection favors accuracy, how can errors, mutations, be the engine of evolution? Seems contradictory.
It does seem that way on the surface, yeah. But think about it like photocopying a document. You want a clear copy, right? That's the goal. But sometimes little smudges or errors creep in.
Right.
The replicator wants, in a manner of speaking, to copy itself perfectly, to preserve its successful structure. But the process isn't flawless. Mistakes happen. These are mutations at the molecular level. Now, most mistakes probably lead to a worse replicator, less stable, slower copying. Those just disappear.
But sometimes.
But sometimes, purely by chance, an error might create a slightly different molecule that is actually better. Maybe it's even more stable, or copies even faster, or, crucially, maybe it can do something new.
Ah, so the errors are the raw material for improvement.
Precisely. Errors are inevitable, but it's the rare, beneficial errors that natural selection then latches onto. The original molecule wasn't trying to change, but the imperfections were the source of novelty, driving this very first stage of evolution.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So these replicators are multiplying, they're varying because of errors, the successful ones are spreading. What happens next as the soup gets crowded?
Competition. As these things become more numerous, the building blocks floating around in the soup, the amino acids, nucleotides, they start getting used up. They become scarce.
Resources get tight.
Exactly. And that leads to a struggle for existence, but at the molecular level. Different replicator lineages are competing for the same raw materials.
So how do they compete? Just by copying faster?
That's one way. But new strategies would emerge. Selection would favor replicators that could actively acquire resources, perhaps by developing a way to break down rival replicator molecules.
Whoa, like eating them. Molecular predators. Sort of. Proto-carnivores, as the book puts it, breaking down competitors to steal their building blocks. That really ramps up the evolutionary arms race.
I'll bet. So defense becomes important too.
Absolutely. Intense competition would strongly favor any replicator that developed some form of protection, maybe a simple chemical coating or a protein shell around itself.
Like an early cell wall or membrane.
Exactly. And this protective coat is seen as a massive step, the beginning of what Dawkins calls survival machines.
Ah, okay. So the replicators aren't just naked molecules anymore.
No, they started building containers for themselves. Vehicles. Shelters. At first, maybe just that simple coat. But as competition got fiercer and new ways of life evolved, like harnessing sunlight, the basis for plants, or eating those photosynthesizers, the basis for animals, these survival machines got incredibly complex and diverse.
And the replicators, the original self-copying molecules, they're still inside. They are. They're not floating free anymore. They are bundled up inside these elaborate machines. Every living thing, bacteria, fungi, plants, animals, us, we are all descendants of those early replicators carried inside the survival machines their ancestors built over billions of years.
And those replicators inside us, today we call them
Genes, DNA.
Well,
that's what they became.
Genes, right. Which brings us neatly to the next big idea, the gene machine. We are the machines. It really flips the perspective, doesn't it?
It totally does. The central idea is that organisms, all living things, are essentially just vehicles, constructed by genes for the purpose of getting those genes copied and passed on. All the incredible variety of life.
Millions of species.
Millions of species, yeah. That's just the result of genes building countless different kinds of survival machines over eons.
And the book suggests thinking of a body not just as cells, but as a colony of genes. The cells are just the workers in the colony.
That's a great way to put it. And the instruction manual for building this machine, this colony, is written in DNA.
The ATCG code, the double helix.
Yep, that's the blueprint. It specifies how to build everything, mostly by dictating the structure of proteins. In humans, this massive instruction set is packed into 46 chromosomes, which come in 23 pairs. You get one set of 23 from your mom, one set of 23 from your dad.
And almost every cell in my body has the complete set.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
In the nucleus, like having the architect's master plans stored in every single room of a giant building.
So in this view, what counts as a gene? Is it just one specific instruction?
Dawkins uses a kind of pragmatic definition here. It's not super rigid. He basically says a gene is any chunk of genetic material, any bit of chromosome that is small enough to potentially last for many generations and get copied many times.
Small enough to not get broken up too often.
Exactly. So a single functional unit, like a cistron that codes for one protein, definitely counts. But he argues that even a small group of related genes that are physically close together on the chromosome can act like a single gene over long evolutionary timescales. If they're so close, they almost always get passed on together without being split by recombination.
Like the butterfly mimicry example.
All right, that cluster of genes controlling mimicry patterns.
Yeah.
Because they stick together, selection acts on them almost as if they were one single gene. It's a functional definition based on longevity across generations.
Okay. Genes are these lasting units. But this leads straight to maybe the biggest question here. If genes are potentially immortal, why do we, the survival machines, the individuals, why do we get old and die?
Yeah, that's central to the gene's eye view. When we talked about longevity for the early replicators and for genes, it's about the potential lifespan of the information, the gene copy, measured in generations, not the lifespan of the physical body it happens to be in right now.
Right.
Think about one of your chromosomes, say the one you got from your dad. It exists as a unit inside your cells, but when you make your own sperm or eggs,
Through meiosis.
through meiosis, yeah, that chromosome gets broken up. Bits of it swap places with the corresponding chromosome you got from your mom. It's called crossing over.
Shuffling the genetic deck.
Exactly. So the specific chromosome from your dad is essentially destroyed as a complete unit. Its lifespan was just one generation yours.
But a gene, a smaller piece.
A small piece, a single gene, is much less likely to be hit or split by one of those random crossing over breaks. The shorter the segment, the higher the chance it passes intact to the next generation and the next and the next. So genes are potentially immortal in that sense. They're the units that endure.
Like those immortal chamois leaping between bodies.
That's the metaphor, yeah. We, the bodies, are just the temporary vehicles.
But why temporary? Why do the vehicles wear out? Why do we die?
Well, the book discusses this, going beyond just simple wear and tear. Peter Medawar's theory is particularly relevant from this gene selection viewpoint. He argued against the old idea that we die for the good of the species.
Right, that doesn't fit the selfish gene idea.
No. Medawar's idea is about how selection acts differently on genes depending on when in the organism's life they have their effects.
How?
Okay, imagine a gene that gives you a big advantage early in life. Helps you survive childhood, find a mate, reproduce successfully when you're young. Selection will strongly favor that gene, right?
Sure, makes sense.
Now, what if that same gene, or maybe another gene that's physically close to it on the chromosome and tends to get inherited with it, also has a negative effect? But this bad effect only kicks in late in life. Say it causes cancer or heart disease, but only after you've likely already had children.
Ah, so after the gene has already been passed on.
Exactly. The force of natural selection against that harmful late effect is much weaker. The damage happens after the gene has already made it into the next generation. Genes causing problems before reproduction get weeded out very efficiently. Genes causing problems after reproduction, well, selection doesn't see them as strongly.
So nasty late-acting genes can accumulate in the gene pool over time?
That's Medawar's theory. The accumulation of these genes, whose benefits are felt early, but whose costs are paid late, could be the fundamental reason why bodies are programmed to decline and eventually die. It's not a sacrifice for the species. It's a side effect of selection pressure dropping off after reproduction.
That is a chillingly logical explanation for mortality.
It fits the framework, doesn't it? And it works whether reproduction is sexual or asexual.
Okay, so these gene-built survival machines, they evolve amazing things, muscles, eyes, brains, and their behavior often looks so purposeful.
It does. You watch an animal hunting or building a nest or caring for young, and it's hard not to think it knows what it's doing, that it has conscious goals.
But the book uses machine analogies.
Right, like a simple thermostat maintains a temperature or a guided missile tracks a target. These machines achieve a goal using basic principles like negative feedback. They don't need to be conscious. Their purpose is just built into their mechanics.
And the link to genes and brains.
Genes are the ultimate programmers, the policymakers. They build the nervous system and set the basic strategy. Survive, replicate. The brain is like the executive, the onboard computer. It takes the gene's general instructions and figures out the best tactics moment to moment based on what's happening in the environment.
So the brain handles the detail.
Yeah. And as brains got more complex, they gain more power to learn, remember, predict, even simulate possible futures to make better decisions. The ultimate goal, maybe, is for genes to just give one simple instruction: do whatever you think is best to keep us alive and copied.
Wow. That really shifts the idea of control. And this leads to animals interacting, communicating.
Yes, communication is just one survival machine affecting the behavior or nervous system of another. But the book suggests that even here, right from the start, there's potential for deception because of that underlying conflict of interest between individuals.
Conflict in communication, like the gazelle example.
The gazelle stunning, leaping high when it sees a predator. The old view was, maybe it's warning the other's altruism. But the gene-centered view suggests it might be signaling to the predator.
Saying what? Don't bother chasing me.
Pretty much. Look how high I can jump. I'm fit. I'm fast. Chasing me will be a waste of your energy. Go pick on someone slower. It benefits the stunning gazelle's genes directly by deterring that specific predator from chasing it. It looks like a group warning, but the underlying driver could be purely selfish.
Fascinating. That idea of underlying conflict, even in interaction, sets us up perfectly for the next section.
Indeed. Section 3. Aggression, conflict, and this key concept from game theory, evolutionary stable strategies, or ESS.
Okay, so why is conflict, especially fighting within a species, so common?
Because, as the book lays out, your most direct competitors are usually members of your own species. You need the exact same food, the same nesting site, the same territories.
And you're competing for the same mates.
Right. The stakes are highest with those who are built just like you and want the exact same things. Plus, as we'll get into more, even potential mates and parents' offspring have built-in conflicts of interest.
So how does this idea of an evolutionary stable strategy from John Maynard Smith help make sense of all this conflict?
Okay, so an ESS is basically a pre-programmed strategy or behavioral rule. The key definition is, it's a strategy that, if most members of a population adopt it, cannot be beaten or invaded by any other rare mutant strategy.
So if a new strategy pops up, it does worse on average.
Exactly. The ESS is stable because it resists invasion by alternatives. Its own success prevents others from gaining ground.
Okay, the classic example to explain this is the hawk-dove game. Can we walk through that?
Sure. It's a simplified model, remember, but very useful. Imagine individuals competing for some resource. They follow one of two inherited strategies, hawk or dove.
Hawk means fight.
Hawk always escalates, fights hard until it's injured or the opponent gives up. Dove, on the other hand, just displays, like posturing or threatening. But if the opponent actually attacks, the dove retreats immediately to avoid injury.
And we need some score, some payoffs to see how they do?
Right. The book uses arbitrary points. Let's use the source's numbers. Winning the resource is worth plus 50 points. Getting seriously injured costs negative 100 points. Wasting time in a long display costs negative 10 points. And losing, just retreating without injury, gets you 0.
Okay, so what happens if everyone in the population is a dove?
Right, a population of only doves. When two doves meet, they posture at each other. Negative is 10 cost each, and eventually one gives up, or they maybe share. The source calculates the average payoff for a dove in a pure dove population is plus 7.5 points per contest. They get the resource sometimes, pay a small display cost, but never get injured.
Seems peaceful enough, but is it stable? What if a single hawk mutant shows up?
That's the test. A hawk meets a dove. The dove postures, negative 10 maybe, but the source implies it gets 0 overall as it escapes. The hawk escalates, the dove instantly flees. The hawk gets the resource, plus 50, with no fight, no injury cost.
So the hawk gets plus 50 while the doves are only averaging plus 7.5 against each other.
Exactly, the hawk does vastly better. Hawk genes would spread like wildfire. So a pure dove population is not an ESS, it's easily invaded.
Okay, what about the other extreme, a population of all hawks?
When two hawks meet, they fight tooth and nail. One wins, plus 50, the other gets badly injured, negative 100. Since they win about half the time and lose half the time against other hawks, the average payoff for a hawk in a hawk-only world is plus 50, 100, 2 equals negative 25 points per fight.
Ouch, that's bad. Very costly.
Very. Now, what happens if a lone dove wanders into this hawk population?
A dove meets a hawk.
The dove displays briefly, sees the hawk attack, and immediately runs away. It gets 0 points for the resource, maybe pays a tiny display cost, but crucially, it avoids that massive M800 injury cost. Let's use the source's figure. The dove gets an average payoff of 0 in this scenario.
So the dove gets 0 while the hawks are averaging negative 25 against each other.
Right. The dove does better. 0 is better than negative 25. So dove genes would start to spread in a hawk population. Pure hawk isn't stable either.
Neither extreme works, so the stable situation, the ESS, must be a mix.
Precisely. With these specific point values, the only stable state is a mixture. An ESS is reached when the population has a specific ratio of hawks to doves, such that the average payoff for being a hawk is exactly equal to the average payoff for being a dove. The source calculates this happens when hawks make up about 712 of the population, or strategies played, and doves make up 512.
And at that ratio, neither strategy can invade.
Correct. If hawks become slightly more common, they encounter more hawks. Their average payoff drops below the doves. If doves become more common, they get exploited by the hawks more often, and their payoff drops below the hawks. It's a stable equilibrium point.
And this mix could be actual hawk individuals and dove individuals?
Or it could be that every individual plays a mixed strategy. They act like a hawk with probability 712 and like a dove with probability 512 in any given encounter. Crucially, if it's a mixed strategy, the choice needs to be unpredictable, random, otherwise the opponent could figure it out and exploit it.
Okay, so the ESS is this stable balance point. What's the really critical takeaway about the ESS versus, say, what's best for everyone?
This is super important.
Yeah.
The ESS is not necessarily the best outcome for the group as a whole. Remember, the pure dove population averaged plus 7.5 points. That's likely higher than the average payoff at the stable hawk-dove mix. The source implies it's lower, maybe 6.25.
So everyone would be better off if they could all just agree to be doves.
Yes. But they can't, because such a system is vulnerable to selfish exploitation by a hawk mutant. The ESS is the state that results from selection acting at the level of the individual strategy or gene, not for the good of the group. Nature settles on ESSs, even if they aren't the nicest or most productive outcome overall.
That's a key insight. Individual selection leads to stable strategies, not necessarily group utopia. What other kinds of conflict does the book analyze with ESS thinking?
Well, there's the war of attrition. Conflicts settled by just seeing who gives up first after a long, costly standoff or display. No actual fighting. The ESS here isn't a fixed time, but rather persisting for variable lengths of time, making it unpredictable.
And differences between opponents, like size.
Asymmetries, yeah.
Yeah.
They make the ESS conditional. If bigger, attack. If smaller, retreat, could be an ESS. Even arbitrary differences, like who owns a territory, can lead to stable conventions.
Like the resident versus intruder strategy.
Exactly. The simple rule, residents always fights, intruders always retreats, can be an ESS. It avoids costly fights most of the time. It explains territoriality. Tinberg and stigglebacks are the classic example. Males fight hard for their own territory, but retreat if they intrude on another's.
What about things like pecking orders, dominance hierarchies?
They fit too, but usually involve animals recognizing each other. After some initial fights, individuals learn their place. Be submissive to those who beat you before, be aggressive to those you beat, is a stable individual strategy. It reduces overall fighting, which is good for the group, but it arises from individual learning and assessment.
And you mentioned cannibalism. Why don't adult lions hunt other adult lions?
From an ESS perspective, the risk of getting seriously injured or killed in return is just too high for the potential payoff. There isn't enough of an asymmetry like there is between a predator and typical prey. Attacking your well-armed neighbor is usually a bad bet. Eating defenseless chicks of your own species, like those gulls, is a different calculation, low risk, high reward.
How does this ESS idea connect back to the bigger picture of the gene pool?
It's fundamental. A gene's success, its fitness, isn't judged in a vacuum. It depends entirely on the environment. And a crucial part of that environment is the other genes currently present in the gene pool.
Ah, the genetic background matters.
Hugely. Genes are selected for how well they work with the other genes they are likely to share a body with. The ESS concept explains how a stable set of interacting genes, a co-adapted gene complex, can arise. Genes that produce strategies or effects that complement each other will be favored. Think of building that rowing crew again. You need the right mix of skills, people who work together. Selection favors genes that are good team players within the context of the current gene pool.
So evolution might not be a smooth climb, but more like steps between these stable plateaus.
That's a possible implication, yeah. Periods of stability at an ESS, punctuated by occasional shifts or transitions when a new strategy manages to invade and destabilize things, leading eventually to a new stable state, a new ESS.
That's a really powerful way to think about conflict and stability. But what about the opposite? Cooperation. How does the selfish gene explain animals helping each other, sometimes at great cost? Altruism.
Right, that brings us to section 4, kin selection and altruism. This tackles one of the biggest apparent challenges to the whole selfish gene idea. Why do animals sometimes risk their necks for others? like those warning calls or parent birds faking injury to lure predators from the nest.
Although, as we saw with the gazelle, maybe even those aren't truly altruistic.
Exactly. The key idea here is that many seemingly selfless acts might actually be subtle ways for genes to help copies of themselves that happen to reside in other bodies. And the most likely place to find copies of your genes is
In your relatives, kin.
bingo. Kinship is the key. Close relatives share a statistically higher proportion of their genes inherited from common ancestors, including, potentially, the very genes influencing altruistic behavior.
Parental care is the obvious one, right? Helping your kids.
Yeah, that's always been understood. Parents share half their genes with each offspring. So a gene that makes a parent invest in its child is effectively helping ensure copies of itself survive and get passed on. But the big leap, especially from W.D. Hamilton, was applying this logic more broadly.
To brothers, sisters, cousins.
To all relatives. The logic is, if performing an altruistic act helps a relative survive or reproduce, and that relative has a certain probability of carrying the same altruism gene, then the act can be favored by selection if the benefit to the relative, weighted by that probability, outweighs the cost to the altruist.
Benefit times probability outweighs cost. That's Hamilton's rule, basically.
That's the core of it, yes. And the probability is quantified by the coefficient of relatedness.
Right. How do we figure that out?
Hamilton showed how. You trace the paths in the family tree between the two individuals via their common ancestors. For each generational step, parent to child or vice versa, you multiply by 12. Then you add up the probabilities for all distinct paths through common ancestors.
Okay, let's do a couple. Parent to child.
One step, R12.
Child to parent.
Same, R12.
Yeah.
Genetically, your parent is as related to you as your child is.
Full siblings, brother or sister.
Okay, you share two parents, path through mom, up from you to mom, 12, down to sibling 12. That's 12. 14, probability of sharing a specific gene via mom. Same path through dad, up to dad 12, down to sibling 12. Another 14 probability via dad, add them up. 14 plus 14 equals 12. So R equals 12 for full siblings, on average.
James, parent, child. Interesting. Half siblings.
Share only one parent.
Yeah.
Path up to that parent, 12, down to half sibling, 12.
Yeah.
Just one path,
Yeah.
12. 14, so R of 14.
Grandparent to grandchild.
Two steps, up to parent 12, up to grandparent 12. Total 12, 2 equals R 12.
Uncle, aunt to nephew, niece.
Yeah.
Let's trace it. From you to your parent, 12. Your parent to their sibling, the aunt, uncle, is R12. Parent to child, nephew, niece, is R12. Source is 14. Let's think. Probability a gene in the uncle is in the nephew. Uncle shares 12 with his sibling, the parent. Parent shares 12 with their child, nephew, so 12.
Well, 14.
Yeah, R14.
Okay, good. And first cousins.
Share grandparents, path. Parent, grandparent, like to uncle, niece, a cousin. It's 4 steps. 12, 4 equals 116. But there are 2 shared grandparents in the pair. So 116 plus 116 plus 116 equals 18. R equals 18 for first cousins.
Perfect. So R tells you the genetic stake you have in a relative. And Hamilton's rule, cost R benefit, gives the condition for when an altruistic gene can spread.
Or putting it starkly like the book does, a gene for suicidal altruism spreads if sacrificing yourself saves more than 2 siblings or kids, or one or more than 4 grandkids or niece nephews, R14, or more than 8 first cousins, R18.
Exactly. The gene is playing the odds to maximize its total number of copies in the next generation across all the bodies it resides in.
And parental care is just one case of this. Helping your baby brother is genetically just as good as helping your own son, R12.
Genetically, yes. Why parental care is overwhelmingly more common has to do with other factors. Certainty of relatedness, usually. Opportunity, the helplessness of infants, things like that. But the underlying genetic logic is the same. And this is kin selection, a result of gene selection, not some fuzzy good of the group idea.
Right. Let's try that mushroom patch example from the source to make the calculation concrete. Say you find mushrooms worth 12 units.
Okay. Option 1. Selfish. Eat it all. Your genes get 12 units benefit, weighted by R1, relatedness to self. Payoff equals 1, 12 equals 12. Wait, the source calculation gives 18. Let me recheck that. Okay, the source seems to use a different baseline or adds other factors. Let's stick to the comparison the source makes. Selfish payoff equals 18 units.
Okay, payoff 18 if selfish. Option 2, altruistic. You call out, and your brother, R12, and first cousin, R18, arrive, and you share the 12 units. What's the payoff to your genes then?
According to the source's calculation for this specific scenario, if you share with a brother and cousin, the total genetic payoff accruing back to your genes, considering their share weighted by relatedness, plus maybe your own smaller share, comes out to 19.5 units.
19.5 for sharing versus 18 for being selfish. So in this case, making the call, being altruistic, actually yields a higher genetic return.
Yes, in that specific scenario with those relatives present, altruism pays off for the altruistic gene. And again, animals aren't doing the math. Selection favors genes that produce behavioral rules of thumb. If you find food and you hear your siblings nearby, make a call. If that rule on average leads to the gene spreading, it persists.
And you can see echoes of this deep kinship awareness in human culture too. Family loyalty, feuds.
The book definitely draws that parallel. Things like ancestor worship, strong family bonds, even blood feuds and nationalism, they tap into this fundamental biological importance of kinship, though human culture obviously adds huge layers of complexity. Incest taboos are related but have a specific genetic reason too, avoiding harmful recessive genes. And studies like the one on lion prides, showing cooperation levels, track average relatedness, offer support in animals.
Okay, so kin selection explains a lot of cooperation. But things aren't always harmonious within the family, are they?
Not at all. Which leads us to Section 5, conflict within the family. Even among close relatives, genetic interests aren't perfectly identical, and that breeds conflict.
Starting with parent-offspring conflict, how does that work?
Okay, think from the parent's view. Genetically, they're equally related to all their offspring, current and potential future ones. Their gene's best strategy is often to spread resources somewhat evenly to maximize the total number of surviving children over their lifetime.
Fair distribution for maximum total output.
Right. But now think from one specific child's perspective. It's related to itself by R1. It's related to its full siblings by only R12.
Ah, so it's twice as interested in itself as in its siblings.
Genetically speaking, yes. So that child's selfish genes want it to demand more than its fair share of parental resources, even if it slightly disadvantages a current or future sibling, because the genetic payoff for investment in this body is higher from its own perspective.
That sets up a fundamental clash. Parents want equality, offspring want more for themselves.
Exactly. You see it in piglets squabbling for the best teat, or human siblings fighting over cake. And the classic example is weaning conflict.
When the parent wants to stop feeding.
Yeah. There comes a point where, from the parent's genetic viewpoint, the benefit of continuing to invest in this offspring is less than the benefit of saving those resources to invest in the next offspring. But the current offspring still benefits from more investment and resists being cut off.
So who tends to win this conflict? The parent is bigger, stronger.
It's not that simple. The book argues both sides have levers of power. Yes, parents are bigger and can physically enforce weaning, just stop providing food. But offspring aren't passive. They have ways to manipulate.
Manipulate how? Crying.
Screaming, crying, begging these signal needs, sure. But they can also be used to exaggerate need, or even as a form of blackmail.
Blackmail? How?
Think about a baby bird screaming loudly in the nest. It attracts the parent's attention, yes. But it might also attract a predator's attention to the whole net.
Oh, right. Putting siblings at risk.
Potentially. So the parent might be forced to give in to the screaming chick's demands, even if it suspects exaggeration, just to shut it up and reduce the risk to the entire brood. It's a risky game for the chick too, of course.
Yeah.
And the ultimate example of offspring ruthlessness is the cuckoo chick. It's raised by foster parents of a different species. It has zero genetic interest in the foster parent's own chicks.
And they just get rid of them.
Some species hatch and immediately push the host's eggs or chicks out of the nest. They ensure they get 100% of the parental care meant for a whole brood. It's brutal, pure selfishness, enabled by the complete lack of kinship.
Wow, okay, so conflict between parent and offspring. What about conflict between mates? The battle of the sexes?
Yep, another key battleground. Both male and female share an interest in their offspring surviving, but they often disagree fundamentally on who should pay the costs of raising them, the time, energy, risk.
And the root of this conflict goes back to eggs versus sperm.
That's the fundamental asymmetry the book focuses on. Eggs are huge, nutrient-packed, and biologically expensive to produce. Sperm are tiny, numerous, and cheap. This means the female makes a much larger initial investment in each offspring even before fertilization.
So she's more committed from the start.
Exactly. She has more invested and therefore more to lose if that offspring dies. This initial disparity often leads to further exploitation.
How so?
Well, Traver's argument, discussed in the book, is about desertion. Which parent can afford to leave the other holding the baby with less cost to their own future reproductive prospects? Often, it's the male.
Because his initial investment was so small.
Right. He might lose that one offspring, but he hasn't invested much time or energy yet, and he could potentially go find another female quickly. The female, having already made the big investment in the egg and maybe pregnancy, is in a tougher spot. Abandoning the offspring means losing that huge initial investment. Often, her best strategy, from her genes perspective, even if she's been deserted, is to try and raise the offspring herself.
The cruel bind.
That's the term used, yes. Of course, females evolve counter-strategies demanding courtship feeding, nests, signs of commitment before mating. And males evolve strategies to avoid being tricked into raising offspring that aren't theirs, sometimes even infanticide when taking over a group. It's an ongoing evolutionary arms race.
And the book uses payoff examples for different strategies, like coy female versus fast female.
Yeah, it models it with hypothetical payoffs for strategies like being choosy, coy, versus mating quickly, fast, for females, and being faithful versus philandering for males. It shows how the success of one strategy depends on what the other sex is doing and how stable mixed strategies or conflicts can arise.
What about things like peacock tails, those huge, costly ornaments males have? How does the battle of the sexes explain those?
That ties into sexual selection, and specifically Zahavi's handicap principle, which the book mentions. The idea is that these aren't just pretty decorations, they are genuine handicaps. A huge tail makes a peacock more visible to predators and harder to fly.
So why have it?
Because only a genuinely high-quality male one, with great genes for health, finding food, escaping predators, could possibly survive and thrive despite such a handicap. So the handicap acts as an honest signal of the male's underlying genetic quality.
And females who choose the most handicapped males
Are effectively choosing good genes for their offspring. Genes for survival and general robustness, not just genes for fancy tails. From the genes perspective, the tail genes in males and the preference for tails genes in females spread together because they end up in successful offspring.
So the conflict over investment leads to these elaborate displays and female choosiness. It's all interconnected.
It is. The fundamental difference in reproductive strategy, males often being high-risk, high-reward gamblers aiming for quantity, females being more focused on the quality and survival of their limited, high-investment eggs, drives much of this dynamic.
Okay, we've seen conflict everywhere, but also cooperation explained by kin selection. What about cooperation between individuals who aren't closely related, or even between different species?
Good question. That takes us to Section 6. Cooperation, mutualism, and the prisoner's dilemma. The theme continues. Even this cooperation can often be understood through selfish gene logic.
Like animals hanging out in groups, flocks, herds. Is that cooperation?
Not necessarily altruistic cooperation. Remember Hamilton's selfish herd idea. It suggests grouping can arise because each individual selfishly tries to reduce its own risk by getting into the middle, using others as a shield against predators on the edge. The herd forms as a byproduct of individual selfishness.
And those warning calls again. Any other selfish takes?
The book mentions the cave theory. Shouting a warning makes your companions freeze or hide, making them less likely to accidentally draw the predator's attention towards you. Self-preservation disguised as a warning.
Okay, but what about the ultimate example, social insects? Worker ants or bees that are sterile, don't reproduce, and sacrifice their lives for the colony. Surely that's altruism.
It looks like the pinnacle of self-sacrifice, doesn't it? But the gene's eye view offers a powerful explanation. Once you accept the workers are sterile, their genes have only one way to get into the next generation, by helping their fertile relatives reproduce.
The queen and the new reproductive males and females.
Exactly. The colony is one giant family. The sterile workers are essentially helping to propagate the genes they share with their mother, the queen, and their siblings, the future queens and drones. A worker dying to defend the hive is, genetically, like one of your own body cells dying. It's sacrificing a temporary vessel that wasn't going to reproduce directly anyway for the benefit of the genes it shares with the reproductive members of the family.
But there's that weird genetic twist in ants, bees, and wasps, right? Haplodiploidy.
Yes, that makes the kin selection argument even stronger in many cases. Remember, females develop from fertilized eggs, diploid 2 sets of chromosomes, males from unfertilized eggs, haploid 1 set. This messes with the relatedness calculations in a fascinating way, especially from a female worker's perspective.
Let's recap those relatedness values again carefully. A female worker, too.
Okay. To her mother, queen, R12, standard. To her own offspring, if she had them, standard. To her brother, he got all his genes from mom, unfertilized egg. She got half from mom, half from dad. The chance they share a specific gene from mom is 12. Her chance of getting it from mom is 12. So 12, no, wait, let's use the logic from before. If she has the gene from dad, 12 chance. Brother can't have it. If she has it from mom, 12 chance. Brother has 12 chance of having it. So 12, 0 plus 12, 12. 14, yes.
Yeah.
14 to her brother.
Okay, 14 to brother. Now, the crucial one, sister to sister.
Right. They share the same mother and the same father. Chance of sharing a gene via mom, 14 as calculated before. Chance of sharing via dad. Dad is haploid, all his sperm are identical. So if worker 1 got a gene from dad, 12 chance. Worker 2 definitely got the exact same gene from dad, 100% chance. So probability via dad, 12, 1 equals 12. Add the paths, 14 via mom plus 12 via dad, to be 3 to 4.
3/4. So a female worker is more related to her sisters than she would be to her own daughters.
Yes, exactly. R34 to a sister, but only R12 to an offspring. And she's much more related to sisters 34 than to brothers 14.
That's wild. And it explains why workers might favor raising sisters.
Precisely. From the perspective of the genes within a worker bee, they get a bigger payoff, more copies into the next generation, by helping the queen produce more reproductive sisters, future queens, than by producing brothers or even having their own offspring, if they could. This explains the evolution of worker sterility and their focus on raising sisters.
And this even leads to conflict over the sex ratio, queen versus workers.
Yes. Travers and Hare predicted this. The queen is equally related, 12, to her sons and daughters, so she wants to invest equally in producing males and females, 1.1 investment ratio. But the workers, being more related to sisters, 34 than brothers, 14, want the colony to invest 3 times as much in raising new queens as in raising males, 3.1 investment ratio.
And who wins?
Travers and Hare argued the workers often win because they control the feeding and rearing of the young. And studies found that in many social insect colonies, the actual investment ratio is indeed closer to the workers' preferred 3.1 female bias.
Amazing. What about those slave-making ants?
That's a brilliant test case. Yeah. In species where ants capture slaves from other nests to do the work, the slave-maker workers don't raise their queen's brood, the unrelated slaves do. The slaves have no genetic bias towards the slave-maker queen's daughters. So who determines the sex ratio?
The queen.
Should be the queen's optimum of 1.1. And Travers and Hare found that indeed, in slave-making species, the ratio is close to 1.1, not the worker-preferred 3.1. Strong evidence for the power of relatedness influencing these outcomes.
Incredible. Okay, so kin selection is powerful. What about cooperation between totally different species? Mutualism, like ants farming fungus.
Yeah, those are great examples. Ants cultivate fungi, protect them, feed them, and eat parts of them. Ants milk aphids for honeydew and protect them. Looks like straightforward win-win. But there's often a potential problem, especially if there's a delay. The problem of cheating or delayed reciprocation. What stops one partner from taking the benefit and running without paying the cost?
Right, and that's where the prisoner's dilemma comes in again.
Exactly. It's a model to understand how cooperation can evolve or fail to evolve when there's a temptation to cheat. Remember the setup. 2 players choose simultaneously to cooperate or defect.
Let's get the payoffs clear, using the book's example numbers.
Okay. Both cooperate, CC. Both get reward, R3 points. 1 defects, 1 cooperates, DC. Defector gets temptation, T5 points. Cooperator gets sucker's payoff, S01. Both defect, DD. Both get punishment, P1 point. And crucially, TRPS.
So temptation 5 is better than reward 3, which is better than punishment 1, which is better than being the sucker 0.
Right. Now, if you play this game just once, what's your best move, assuming you're purely self-interested?
Well, if the other player cooperates, I should defect. 5 is better than 3. If the other player defects, I should also defect. 1 is better than 0. So, always defect.
Always defect. It's the dominant strategy in a one-shot game. But the tragedy is, if both players follow this logic, they both defect and end up with only 1 point each. If they had somehow managed to cooperate, they'd both have gotten 3 points.
Individually rational choices lead to a collectively worse outcome. That's the dilemma.
That's the dilemma. So how does cooperation ever get started?
Repeated interactions, playing the game over and over with the same player.
That's the key insight, the iterated prisoner's dilemma. The shadow of the future changes everything. Robert Axelrod's famous computer tournaments explore this. He invited people to submit strategies and pitted them against each other in long-running simulations.
And the winner was tit for tat.
Tit for tat, submitted by Anatol Rappaport. Incredibly simple strategy.
Rule 1, cooperate on the first move.
Rule 2, after that, just do whatever the other player did in the last move. Copycat.
And this simple thing beat complex strategies. Why?
Axelrod analyzed why. Tit for tat is nice. It's never first to defect. Retaliatory, it immediately punishes defection. Forgiving, it returns to cooperation instantly if the opponent does. And clear, its simple rule is easy for opponents to figure out.
So it encourages cooperation but doesn't get pushed around.
Exactly. It wasn't necessarily the highest scorer in any single match, but it did the best on average across the whole tournament. And evolutionary simulations where successful strategies reproduce more Tit for tat proved very robust and often came to dominate the population. Nasty strategies might flourish briefly by exploiting naive cooperators, but then they'd run out of victims and just end up defecting against each other, getting low scores.
But there was that problem of getting started, the knife edge.
Right. If everyone else is playing always defect, a single tit-for-tat player does poorly. It cooperates first, gets 0, then defects forever after, gets 1. It struggles to increase when rare.
So how does it overcome that?
The power of clustering. Tit-for-tat benefits hugely if players interact more often with players like themselves. If a small group of tit-for-tat players forms, perhaps just by chance or maybe because relatives live near each other,
Kinship again helping cooperation get started.
it could provide the initial clusters. Inside that cluster, tit-for-tat players interact with each other, cooperate repeatedly, and rake in 3 points per round. Meanwhile, the always defectors outside the cluster are only getting 1 point from each other. The tit-for-tat cluster thrives and can then expand, converting the defectors or outcompeting them. Always defect gets no benefit from clustering.
So repeated interactions plus some way for cooperators to interact more with each other allows reciprocity to evolve. Are there real-world examples of this dynamic?
The book suggests several. Maybe the informal cooperation collusion sometimes seen between lawyers on opposing sides, where following established rituals benefits both lawyers, more fees, at the expense of clients. Not necessarily conscious, but an ESS arising from repeated interaction.
Biological example.
The hermaphrodite sea base, taking turns, playing male-female roles that could be tit-for-tat, ensuring fairness in a costly interaction. And vampire bats, sharing blood meals.
Right, they share with roost mates they interact with repeatedly.
Exactly. They live in stable groups, interact often. The benefit of receiving blood when starving is huge. The cost of giving when full is relatively small. Cheating is possible. It fits the conditions for iterated prisoner's dilemma perfectly. Sharing blood could be maintained by a tit-for-tat-like reciprocity. I'll share with you because you share with me.
It really shows how these simple game theory ideas can potentially explain complex social behaviors.
From bats to potentially even human interactions, yeah.
Okay, genes building bodies, genes strategizing through conflict and cooperation. But the book introduces another kind of replicator, doesn't it? Something beyond biology.
It does. Section 7, memes. Dawkins basically says, look, DNA has ruled the roost as the main replicator for billions of years, but maybe it's not the only possible kind of replicator.
And human culture created a new environment.
Our brains, products of genetic evolution, created a new kind of soup, the soup of human culture. And in this soup, a new kind of replicator arose, the meme.
Meme. What does he mean by meme exactly? Not just internet pictures back then.
No, definitely not. It's defined as a unit of cultural transmission, or a unit of imitation. Think of a catchy tune, an idea, a fashion trend, a cooking recipe, a way of building arches, a religious belief, a scientific theory, anything that can be passed from mind to mind.
And they replicate through imitation, learning.
Primarily imitation, yeah. Just like genes use cellular machinery to get copied, memes use human brains in communication. You hear a story, you retell it, the meme, the story has replicated. You see someone tie a knot, you learn that the meme, the knot tying technique, has replicated into your brain.
So memes evolve too, like genes, competing in the meme pool.
That's the analogy. Some memes are better at getting copied and spreading than others. They compete for our attention, for space in our memory, for bandwidth and communication channels. There's a kind of natural selection among memes.
What makes a meme successful? Similar factors to genes. Longevity, fecundity, accuracy.
Pretty much, by analogy.
Maybe less about the lifespan of one copy, like a thought in one head, and more about its potential permanence, written down, recorded.
How fast and wide does it spread? Think of a viral internet meme today, or a hit song, or a scientific idea getting cited everywhere.
How accurately is it copied? Memes definitely mutate, stories change in retelling, ideas get simplified, but some fidelity is needed for it to remain recognizable.
And can memes have strategies to help them spread? Like the genes for peacock tails?
The book suggests they can. Memes can evolve features that enhance their own transmission, sometimes regardless of whether they're true or even good for the humans hosting them. The example given is a religious doctrine, like the threat of hellfire.
How is that a meme strategy?
Well, a belief system that includes the instruction, believe this fervently, teach it to your children, and punish anyone who doubts it, or you will suffer eternal agony. That's an incredibly powerful mechanism for ensuring the meme's own survival and faithful replication. The meme essentially coerces its hosts into spreading it. It works from the meme's perspective.
And this isn't exclusively human. birds learning songs.
Right, the source mentions cultural transmission in birds, like saddlebacks learning local song dialects by imitation. Changes in the songs are like cultural mutations. So the basic idea of copied information evolving isn't unique to us, but it's obviously exploded in complexity and importance in human culture.
Wow. Thinking of ideas and culture itself as evolving replicators, that's a whole other layer.
It's a different lens to view cultural change, yeah.
Okay, one more major concept from the book, which seems to stretch the gene's influence even further. The extended phenotype.
Section 8. Yes, this is a really important refinement of the gene-centered view. It challenges the assumption that a gene's effects, its phenotype, are limited to the body it sits inside.
So phenotype is usually like your eye color, your height, physical traits coded by your genes.
Right. And selection acts on those traits. The extended phenotype idea says a gene's influence can actually reach outside the organism's skin. It can manipulate the environment or even manipulate other organisms.
How on earth does that work? Sounds a bit strange.
The logic is simple. Natural selection favors any gene whose effects, wherever they occur, contribute to that gene's survival and replication. The effect doesn't have to be on the body carrying the gene. Take the caddis larva example again. It builds a little house out of stones.
Right, we mentioned that. The house is outside its body.
But the behavior of building the house is controlled by the larva's genes. Those genes influence its nervous system, which directs the actions of finding stones, sticking them together. So the book argues the physical properties of that stone house, its shape, its strength, are part of the phenotypic expression of the caddis larva's genes. They are effects of the genes, manifested in the external world. Selection acts on genes for building good houses, not just genes for strong muscles in isolation.
So the house is an extension of the larva's gene's reach.
That's the idea. And the book points out we find this less impressive than, say, a beaver dam, maybe because it's instinct, but the principle is the same genes controlling external constructions.
Okay, building things. What about influencing other living things? Parasites.
Parasite manipulation is a prime example of the extended phenotype. The parasite's genes are inside the parasite, but they can produce effects chemicals, signals that alter the host's body or behavior for the parasite's benefit.
Like making the host act weirdly so it gets eaten by the next host.
Exactly. The ant climbing the grass blade to be eaten by a sheep. That suicidal behavior is an extended phenotype of the parasite's genes inside the ant. Or the fluke in the snail affecting the snail's shell thickness. The fluke's genes benefit from a strong shell, just like the snail's genes do. But their optimal shell thickness might differ slightly. Why? Because their route to the next generation, their outlet, is different.
Snail genes leave via snail eggs. Fluke genes leave when the snail gets eaten.
Right. So their interests aren't perfectly aligned regarding the shell. The shell thickness is influenced by genes in both organisms. It's a shared phenotypic effect with potential conflict.
Ah, that outlet idea again. What if the parasite and host share the same outlet? Like if the parasite gets passed on in the host's eggs or sperm.
Now that changes everything. If the parasite's genes can only get to the next generation via the host's reproduction, their evolutionary interests become completely aligned. The parasite's genes are now selected to help the host survive and reproduce, because that's their only ticket to the future, too.
So parasitism evolves towards cooperation, mutualism.
Yes, or even complete integration. The parasite might become an essential symbiont. Its own body might even simplify over time, becoming just part of the host's machinery.
Because their genetic fates are now tied together. Any examples?
The source mentions those ambrosia beetles and bacteria. The bacteria get passed on in the beetle eggs. They actually manipulate the beetle's reproduction, causing unfertilized eggs to become female sometimes, in ways that likely benefit the transmission of both beetle and bacterial genes. Their destinies are linked via the egg. Or the hydra and algae example. Some algae infect hydra, make it sick, and spread independently. Others live inside hydra cells, help it with photosynthesis, and crucially get passed on via the hydra's eggs. These latter algae are mutualists. Their genes are aligned with the hydras because they share the same reproductive bottleneck.
So cooperation arises when genes are forced to share the same exit route to the future.
That's a key insight from the extended phenotype perspective. Selection acts on gene effects wherever they occur. And cooperation, whether within a body or between formerly distinct entities, is often the result of those genes having their futures irrevocably tied together, usually by passing through the same reproductive bottleneck. The unified organism itself is a product of this forced cooperation.
Which leads perfectly to the final section, right? Why are organisms these neat, discrete packages?
Section 9. The organism as a vehicle. If genes are the stars, why is life usually bundled into these distinct individuals' multi-celled bodies like ours, rather than, say, just continuously spreading like a slime mold?
Yeah, why this separate bodies each generation?
A key reason highlighted in the book is the bottlenecked life cycle. Most complex organisms, like us, start each generation from a single cell. A fertilized egg, a zygote, that's the bottleneck. Everything grows from that single starting point. Contrast that with something reproducing by, say, broad-fronted budding, where a whole chunk of the parent just breaks off and becomes a new individual, like some plants or corals maybe.
So starting from one cell is important. Why?
The book suggests three main advantages of this bottleneck for creating a unified, cooperative organism. First, it's like going back to the drawing board. A fresh start from a single cell allows development to be highly organized and coordinated. Less chance for errors or chaotic growth compared to just budding off complex parts.
A clean developmental slate each time.
Second, it helps create an orderly timing cycle. Starting from one cell makes it easier to synchronize all the complex gene switching and developmental steps needed to build a body correctly.
And third, crucially,
Cellular uniformity. Because every cell in your body, apart from sperm eggs, descended from that one initial zygote, they're all essentially genetically identical clones. Are one between all your body cells.
maximum possible relatedness within the body.
Exactly. And that leads directly back to cooperation. Why do your liver cells cooperate with your heart cells? Because the genes inside them are identical copies. They share the exact same evolutionary interest. The survival and reproduction of the whole vehicle, your body, because that's the only way any of them get their genes into the next generation, via the sperm or eggs, the bottleneck.
So the bottleneck forces alignment. My liver cells don't try to reproduce independently because they can't pass genes on that way. Their only route is helping the whole me reproduce.
Precisely. The shared fate imposed by the bottleneck enforces cooperation among the genes within the body. Compare that to a wolf pack.
Different wolves, different genetic destinies.
Mostly. They cooperate due to kinship and maybe reciprocity, but the genes in one wolf are ultimately competing with genes in other wolves because they don't pass through the same reproductive bottleneck together. There's no merging into a single vehicle.
And if genes could cheat the bottleneck,
like those segregation distorter genes that bias meiosis, they act more selfishly because they have found a way to partly decouple their fate from the rest of the genome. They become less cooperative.
so the discrete cooperative organism exists because the bottleneck life cycle aligns the selfish interests of the genes packed inside that vehicle, forcing them to work together for the shared goal of getting through that bottleneck.
That's the synthesis presented. The organism is the ultimate survival machine, shaped by the need for internal cooperation driven by a shared genetic destiny through the bottleneck.
Wow. Okay. That is an incredible journey of ideas we've discovered, from the very first replicators to genes building us as survival machines, navigating conflict with ESS, cooperation via kin selection and reciprocity, the whole idea of memes as cultural replicators, the gene's influence stretching out in the extended phenotype, and finally understanding the organism itself as a consequence of the bottleneck. It's a lot.
It really is a comprehensive and, for many, a revolutionary way to look at the whole story of life, always coming back to the gene's perspective.
And we absolutely have to stress this point again because it's so important, and the book itself makes it clear. This is a scientific description of how evolution works based on gene replication. It is not a moral blueprint for how humans should behave.
Couldn't agree more. That distinction is critical. Understanding our biological heritage, the selfish tendencies hardwired by evolution, is absolutely not the same as saying we should be selfish. In fact, the book issues a pretty stark warning.
Yeah, that a society based only on the raw principles of gene selfishness, ruthless competition, exploitation would be, well, frankly, horrible. Really nasty place to live. Our evolved biological tendencies don't automatically create an ethical society.
Biology isn't morality.
But, and this is the amazing flip side, the truly empowering part of the message, because we humans can understand this, because we have consciousness and culture, we can choose differently. We have the unique ability, unlike any other species we know of, to actually rebel against the dictates of our selfish genes.
We can understand their programming.
And decide to deliberately override it. We can choose generosity, empathy, altruism towards strangers, cooperation on a massive scale, things that don't necessarily make strict selfish gene sense. This capacity for conscious, chosen altruism is kind of incredible when you think about our origins.
It highlights the power of culture, reason, and empathy to shape our behavior beyond pure biology.
So maybe the final thought to leave everyone with is this. Given this deep evolutionary history, this bedrock of gene-level selfishness that shaped all life, isn't our human capacity for genuine conscious kindness and cooperation utterly remarkable? How precious is that ability to choose empathy over instinct? And what does that potential tell us about the kind of world, the kind of society we actually want to build, knowing we can strive for something different from the purely biological script?
Definitely food for thought. A lot to reflect on there.
It really is. Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the selfish gene. We hope it's given you, our listeners, a fascinating, maybe challenging, but ultimately powerful new perspective on life, evolution, and maybe even ourselves.